I'm going to start with some introductory remarks, brief introductory remarks. Welcome to this particular panel on political ramifications of the European Union crisis. As I think most of you know, and all should know, this is the first panel of a conference which runs tonight and then all day tomorrow here at the Center for European Studies on Europe in a post-crisis world. There are posters around and programs around that indicate what will be discussed not only today, but also tomorrow. And I encourage those of you with an interest in the European Union, which I presume is pretty much everyone here, to attend as much as you can of the conference tomorrow. We have some very, very well-informed individuals speaking on topics of great current and longer-term interest in European economics and politics. The event is organized by the Center for European Studies, along with the program on transatlantic relations of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, with generous support from the Schumpeter program. I should have said, by the way, up front that I'm Jeffry Frieden, and I'll be chairing the panel tonight. We are in the midst of what has been the longest and deepest crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. We know that economic crises often, if not always, have political effects. In fact, looking back to the 1930s, we associate that crisis with the rise of militarism, extreme nationalism, fascism in Europe and elsewhere. We also associate it with the rise of much of what we think of as being the modern welfare state and modern social democracy. So major political effects of the crisis of the 1930s. I am sure that there will be long-term effects of the current crisis in the European Union, and there have already been shorter-term effects. Most of us will know that most, if not all, but most of the governments that were in office in countries that entered into recession in 2007, 2008 were turned out of office at the first opportunity that voters had to do so. We're addressing today, in the panel today, the specific issue of the political ramifications of the crisis in the European Union. And we have three and soon to be four, we hope, very astute and very well-informed observers to comment on the topic. We also hope to be able to will turn to the audience for more general discussion. The format will be as follows. I've asked each of the four panelists to speak for about 10 minutes with introductory remarks. After that, we will open things up to the floor, to discussion among the panelists and also discussion with you as well, so that we can get some back and forth among other participants in the conference and other members of the audience. Let me introduce the panelists in the order in which they will speak. First, to my far left, geographically, we have Peter Hall, who is the Krupp Foundation Professor of European Studies, former director, I believe, of the Center for European Studies. Also, something I didn't know, but I got from the bio, Peter, the co-director of the Program on Successful Societies for the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. I just have to ask how many successful societies are incorporated in that, but anyway. And Peter is, as I'm sure...
I hope you'll make fun of everybody as you introduce them.
I only make fun of my closest friends. And Peter is as you will all know, I think, the co-editor of or author of far too many books and articles to even begin to make a dent in, and a very, very distinguished observer of European politics and economics. After Peter, we have Andrés Sapir, who is a professor of economics at the Universite Libré in Brussels. He is also a senior fellow of BRUEGEL, a leading think tank in Brussels. André has been heavily involved in European politics for many, many years. He's a former member of the Economic Advisory Group to the EU Commission's president. He's a former economic advisor to the Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs, a former economic advisor to President Romano Prodi. Then, to his left, again geographically only, Loukas Tsoukalis, who is a professor of European integration at the University of Athens, president of the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, whose acronym is ELIAMEP. He's a visiting professor at King's College in London and at the College of Europe in Bruges, formerly special advisor to President of the European Union Commission, and again, the author of far too many works to mention. And then finally, eventually to join us, we hope, on his way, we are told by phone, Larry Summers, who is former chief economist of the World Bank, former director of the National Economic Council, Secretary of the Treasury, and president of Harvard University. He is currently the Charles Eliot University professor. I should say, probably should have started with this, that I apologize in advance. I'm recovering from eye surgery 3 weeks ago, and my vision is still very limited. I mean, literally, figuratively goes without saying, but literally my vision is very limited, which means a number of things. First of all, I'm probably going to be putting on sunglasses because the glare bothers my eyes. And second, if I start dabbing at my eyes in the midst of the talk, it's not because I'm crying crocodile tears over the state of Europe, it's because my eyes are... and third, perhaps most important, when it comes time to discussion, I may ask some of the panelists to help me. I won't be able to recognize people, but I do hope to be able to see hands that are raised. So in any event, with no further ado, let me turn first to Peter Hall.
Jeff, thanks very much for that gracious introduction. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with such a distinguished set of economists, and I'm going to leave a lot of the economics to them, but we've been asked to talk about, I was certainly asked to talk about the political implications of the Euro crisis for the future of European integration. And since this was Halloween, if I'd had time, I would have bought a pirate's hat to wear for this purpose in light of what I'm going to say. But any speaker on a panel of this sort faces basically two challenges. I mean, the first is to say something, anything comprehensible about such a complex issue in 10 minutes. And there's no question that the future of European integration is a complex issue. And the second challenge facing those of us on this panel, and indeed any such panel, is to say something true but not obvious. And so I'm going to use my 10 minutes to assert that the Euro crisis, in both its genesis and its devolution, represents, I think, the greatest setback to European integration since the Treaty of Rome in 1958. And that's saying something for those of us who remember Charles de Gaulle. There have been other setbacks. And it seems to me that this contention, while certainly debatable, is also not obvious. Because there are at least two reasons why we might think that the crisis will issue in more intense integration, more integration in the European Union. First of all, we know that the crisis has been accompanied by an intense burst of intergovernmental activity. I think the heads of government have probably met more often in the European Council over the last 4 years than they did in the previous 10 years, if not the previous 20 years. So the Europeans have worked together very hard and very intensively, and by the way, I think we shouldn't forget this. So in that sense, there seems like more integration. And secondly, many economists, many European politicians now say that the only way out of the crisis is by legislating even more political integration. And this is quite logical. And I think that that does offer one path towards solutions to the crisis, one route to avoiding the kinds of problems that generated the crisis. And so it's not surprising to see so many calls across the capitals of Europe for more Europe, as Mrs. Merkel put it. Well, why then, given this, do I say that the crisis has deeply set back the prospects for further political integration in Europe? I'm going to mention three, and if I have time, I'll mention four. I may only make it to three. First, as far as I can see, the Euro crisis has left the EU without any credible guiding purpose. And having a guiding purpose is surely a prerequisite for what's supposed to be, in that famous phrase, an ever closer union. At its inception in 1958, and I think for more than 2 decades afterwards, as I think everybody in this room knows, the European community was animated by an abiding desire to deliver peace to Europe. Its motto might well have been never again. And of course, the European community, the EEC, then the European community in those years, served a number of economic interests as well, as Andy Moravchik and others would point out. But its animating spirit, in my view, palpable among those who led it or worked it over these years, was this desire to secure and ensure peace across the European continent. But then, of course, as we all know, as that first generation faded away, the promise that the EU held out seemed to change, and I think it did change. And I date this change roughly from the Single European Act of 1986. After about the middle of the 1980s, I think, what the European Union promised its successor generations was prosperity and opportunity, well reflected and in some sense made possible by a new single market. Now, what did this mean? This meant that for any given negotiation, to be sure, for any member state, there were short-term sacrifices to be made on behalf of a greater good. But the promise of these measures was that despite short-term costs, in the end, everyone would gain. The European Union became, in some sense, a positive-sum project, became an economic project, and it became what political scientists would call a positive-sum project. Well, I think in the wake of the Euro crisis, very unfortunately, this looks more and more like an empty promise. Despite the rhetorical window dressing, the painful decisions that have been taken over the last 3 years look, to many people, not just me, look more and more like zero-sum decisions. Decisions by which some gain and others lose. Not just over the short term, but over long periods of time. And whether fairly or not, I think the European Union looks especially like this from the perspective of Southern Europe. I mean, we hear from Southern Europeans, they can disagree with me if they want. But what promise does the European Union now hold for the younger generations in Southern Europe, where more than half of those under the age of 25 are unemployed? Everyone is elated, the financial press is certainly elated that there's been a small, tiny uptick in growth in the Eurozone. But is it plausible that youth unemployment is going to drop below 20 or 30% in these countries over the next 5 or 6 years? I think it isn't plausible. And I think it's painful but realistic to say, as a result, that the European Union no longer has a viable, overarching mission which all can applaud and on which all can agree. That's my first point. Here's my second point. Secondly, it seems to me that more intense political integration that many are seeking, especially if it entails the pooling of sovereignty over budgets, and not just the level of budgets, but the composition of budgets, and that is now being done. This pooling of sovereignty is probably only viable over the longer term if it's accompanied by further measures to make the European Union more accountable to national electorates. Short term, it can be done this way. In the longer term, it seems to me it has to be accompanied to be at all viable, and not just theoretically viable, but politically viable by some steps to make the European Union more accountable to national electorates. But national electorates are not as enthusiastic about the European Union as they were before. And this is largely a legacy of the crisis. So we've learned over the past 3 years that social solidarity stops at national borders in Europe. I wish that weren't true. I study Europe. I study Europe because I am deeply attached to Europe, and I'm attached to some of the principles of social solidarity that it represents. But I think we see in this crisis that social solidarity stops at national borders. The press is full of images of lazy Greeks and jackbooted Germans. I guess we'll be hearing from some of those later on in the course of this conference. And this is taking a predictable toll on the willingness of ordinary people to countenance further integration. And that's true in the north of Europe as much as it is in the south of Europe. The opinion polls show, the Pew studies are very instructive on this, show that the number of people saying that the European Union is a good thing is declining steadily across the continent. And I think we're going to see the results of this in the European elections coming in the coming spring. We welcome Lauren Summers here to this panel. So I think everybody here obviously knows that in the opinion polls in France, we can't trust opinion polls completely, and it's a long time. As Harold Wilson said, a week is a long time in politics, so it's a long time till next spring. But the current polls show that the party likely to win the most votes in France in those elections is the Front National. There are some people who predict that the outcome of those elections in the spring will be that the largest single bloc in the European Parliament might well be formed by Eurosceptic parties. We can hope for something better, but we can't count on it. So it seems to me that the desire for further political integration, which is the legitimate aspiration of many of the political elites of Europe at the moment, is at odds with the direction in which public opinion itself is moving. 5 minutes, no problem. Couldn't you wait for 2 minutes? Here's my third point. Third, in my view, and again, this is open for debate, I think that we are seeing the consolidation, that is to say something well past the emergence of a multi-speed Europe on the continent. That is to say, a Europe marked by much more intense cooperation in some spheres and among some countries than others. We see more intense consultation in the Eurozone. We see a British attempt to secure even more opt-outs, lest its electorate go for the final opt-out. We see a willingness on the part of the European Union to treat some countries, such as Cyprus, quite differently than the Union's treating other countries. So I have never thought that a multi-speed Europe in itself was bad for European integration. But that was when I thought that the result might be a stable one, devoted to more intense integration in some spheres, and a stable periphery, happy with something less. But I think the mishmash that is now emerging is anything but stable. The Eurozone countries themselves represent member states with widely varying views about the desirability of further integration. And more important, widely discrepant views about what this prominent phrase, more Europe, should actually mean. And the periphery contains countries as diverse in their views about what they want. And by the periphery, I mean countries which maybe want somewhat less integration, aren't yet in the Eurozone. That's a diverse group of member states running all the way from Britain to Poland to Hungary. What each of them wants is somewhat different. So I see no stable coalitions here. And therefore, I see the multi-speed Europe that's developing as something that has no readily discernible future and a good deal, a serious prospect of divisiveness ahead of it. And then finally, before I pass the baton to the economists, who can speak more accurately perhaps about this, I must say I think the long-term economic prospects of the continent look bad. In my view, just to provoke people, I will say that I think that the growth strategy of the European Union is structural reform, and I think structural reform is undoubtedly desirable in the medium to long term, but I don't think it's going to bring growth in the short term, and I think what it means is very unclear. I think it's a mantra, a fig leaf, offered as the growth strategy by those who know they have to have a growth strategy, but don't really have one. And in the longer term, beyond that, which we'll talk about tomorrow, I think demographic trends clearly suggest to us that Europe is facing a very difficult position. No one is having babies in Europe except in France and in Sweden, perhaps. And high levels of youth unemployment is rapidly reducing the birth rate in existing countries. The birth rate in Greece is down by, I think, about 5% in the past 3 years. And of course, the solution to that is immigration. But this is a continent deeply ambivalent about immigration. So can the European Union survive if its tide does not lift all boats? That, I think, is really the central question that I want to pose here. Well, yes, almost certainly. The European Union can survive. I'm not predicting the demise of the European Union. But can the European Union prosper in political as well as economic terms? And I'm suggesting to you that I think it cannot, at least sitting here tonight with this view, which I express with some regret. So I hope I'm wrong. And I've learned over the years that one should never underestimate the European Union. Sometimes I think the symbol of the European Union, instead of that blue flag with the yellow stars, the symbol of the European Union should be the phoenix, because the phoenix is the bird that always rises from the ashes. But at the moment, all I can say is, some bird, some ashes.
Thank you, Peter. Andrés Sapir.
Thanks. Let me state right from the start that I don't really disagree with what has just been said, and I mean I will address pretty much the same issues, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be able on all of those issues to give a rebuttal. Because as I said, I think that the points that have just been made are well taken. I will divide my remarks in two parts. Before coming to the longer term or to this governance issue, to the future, I want to address a little bit how the crisis has been managed, again from a political viewpoint, and then go on to the more medium term or longer term of the governance. I think we can all agree that the management of the crisis has been suboptimal, to say the very least. And I think when I look back on the issues, I think it must be said that we, in general, we were very ill prepared, both intellectually and institutionally. I mean, I can say for myself that intellectually, what we had looked at different scenarios that would occur. Not many of those scenarios involved what did actually occur. And as a result of not having either the intellectual framework to deal with the crisis, nor, even worse, to have the institutions, nothing had been prepared, the fact of the matter is that I think what we have witnessed since the start of the crisis is that, in fact, and that goes a bit to what Peter just said, but in a different manner, there has not been an agreement on what are the root causes of the crisis. And therefore, no wonder that the management of the crisis has been difficult, not only because they were not the institution, the instruments, but also because there was not an intellectual framework to understand and to deal with the problems. And you all have seen Paul Krugman's latest paper to be presented at the IMF, where he discussed of this balance. Is it a balance of payment, or is it a public debt crisis? And I think there's still this kind of discussion, and some countries, or maybe some country, put more emphasis on the public debt issue, and others maybe more on the balance of payments, which has huge amount of implication about how the adjustment has to be made. In a sense, I think I do want to devote some time about the German conundrum in this. I think a word that was not pronounced by Peter. If one looks back at the monetary union, one of the reasons for having created the monetary union, certainly on the part of other countries than Germany, was to solve this German asymmetry problem. We had the European monetary system, and the monetary system was really dominated by Germany. It was the Bundesbank that was setting the monetary policy of Germany, but as a result of the entire monetary system. And the view was that no, one needs to have a symmetric system. And the monetary union was a symmetric system for a while, and now we are back, in a sense, in an asymmetric system, with again Germany at the center. Now, I think I do have some degree of appreciation for, I think, the difficulty where Mrs. Merkel, to talk about politics, found herself at the start of the crisis, at the start of the, let's say, the sovereign debt crisis, the Greek part of the crisis. I think it must be said that citizens in Germany had not been much in favor of monetary union prior to create the monetary union. We know that. And at the same time, one thing one is also to appreciate that Germany, when it entered into the monetary union, it entered with an overvalued currency. And we all remember that in the early part of the euro, Germany was the sick man of Europe. Now, here was the largest country of the euro area, which was the sick man of Europe, and was being labeled as such. every week almost on the cover of the Financial Times, on the cover of The Economist, as the sick man of Europe. Not exactly a very easy position, but it was indeed sick in the sense that unemployment was rising very, very much. And Germany did make huge amount of adjustment. And therefore, I think in Germany there was not the sympathy at the start for other countries not suffering the pain. Okay, no, you guys are the sick man of Europe, and you do as we do. I think that also showed, I think, a lack of appreciation in Germany of how Germany itself solved its own problem. And that's back to the balance of payment problem. I think clearly Germany was helped by the fact that there was expansion in the southern countries, and that helped Germany to solve its own problem. But I think that was not quite appreciated. And in a sense, I think we have paid a dear price for the Greek crisis to have erupted before it had erupted in Ireland or in another country. Because then it became labeled, and maybe in an easy manner, as a fiscal crisis, as a public debt crisis. And again, I mean, if you have read the paper by Krugman, you will see that, well, Greece, you could really label it as either a balance of payment or a debt crisis. It's a bit of both, really. Okay? The huge balance of payment, a huge current account deficit, and also a very major debt problem. If it had happened first in Ireland, and it could have happened, I mean, it was basically an accident of history, maybe we would have seen the crisis differently. Now, I would pose that Germany is a bit in a quandrum today, because on the one hand, it is in a rather comfortable position. The economic situation in Germany, and you spoke, Peter, of an asymmetry there between the core and the periphery. If you look at the euro area countries, there is only one country in the euro area, i.e. Germany, where the unemployment rate has decreased between 2007, the start of the financial crisis, and today. Only one country, and in a really radical manner. At the start, in 2007, unemployment in Germany was above euro area average, was a little bit above Spain. This is hard to believe. In 2007, higher unemployment, and it reduced in a significant manner, whereas everywhere else it increased in a rather important manner. So in a sense, the crisis has not been bad for Germany from that viewpoint. When you look at its situation, you know, unemployment, and which is what most citizens care about. At the same time, I think Germany understands very well that everyone else is uncomfortable in this situation. And Germany, I think, doesn't like to find itself at the center again, and needs to deal with it. It's being asked to do certain things. And the fact that it has this large current account surplus, today the US Treasury has declared the US as having too large a current account surplus. The same is happening in the European Union. So there is a lot of pressure on Germany to act. Now, Germany at the same time, I think, has been putting a lot of pressure on others to act. And I think one can ask oneself why it has been doing that and for what reason. Now, I would like to submit, and that is now moving into the second part, into the future. I think there is indeed an issue that we had at the start of the euro that we underestimated, which was that we had two groups of countries. We had the old D-mark zone countries, and we had the countries of the periphery. By the way, this expression core periphery was there 20 years ago. This is not a new expression. It was there in the literature. People were discussing that. And whether or not one can do at the start a euro area with those two groups of countries. Now, I think we had those two groups of countries at the beginning. Some, including some economists, led us to believe that there was going to be endogenous convergence. That, you know, there was differences, but the euro itself would lead to convergence. That has not happened. Now, today I think we are indeed in a situation, I think, where we are in a very uncomfortable equilibrium or disequilibrium. And I think as we look to the future, I fully agree with Peter that there is this problem of the common project. And I think without a common project, there can't be a solution to this problem. There's no point talking about governance, as one does in Europe, without first talking of the project. A governance is a means to an objective. What is the objective? And the objective has got to be indeed an economic objective, which means some place employment, prosperity. that has to be spelled out. Now, is it possible to do that given the diversity of the countries? No. I think the situation that we had at the start of the euro, the Maastricht system, which was only a monetary policy in common and no other policy together, only negative integration, let's say fiscal rules, this system I think has proved to be not viable. At the same time, I don't think that it's viable really to discuss the United States of Europe or the United States of the euro area. So the question that we are faced with all the time, I think, is there some kind of an intermediate solution? Something which is more than what we had at Maastricht and something which is less than what is not feasible for a long time, this United States of Europe. And given the diversity of the countries and given the point where we are starting now, which is a crisis, and acrimony and increased divergence between the countries. So clearly not the best place to start from. So in that sense, I agree with Peter, a very, very difficult situation. Now, I think we are making some progress. I think the banking union, I think, is an absolutely fundamental element. And the banking union is a response to a clear question, which is stability, financial stability. So it's not just sort of a bureaucratic invention of people in Brussels who are trying to sort of devise something, let's do something together, but of a purely bureaucratic nature. I think a problem has been identified. There was no institution, there was no real way to deal with this. For myself, I think we need a European FDIC, I mean more than a banking union, a real FDIC, but it's to answer a problem which was not present at all in Maastricht. Nobody had really thought about this financial crisis, and we are doing that. No, but I think this is not going to be enough. No. Let me just conclude what I think should be the project. I don't see really the leaders to carry the project, but I think what the project needs to be. The project has got to be some kind of a grand bargain that involves both the future and the present or the past. And that involves the countries of the periphery and the country at the core. I think the countries at the core, Germany first, must give time and support to the countries of the periphery to solve the legacy problems. That means much more symmetric adjustment than has taken place so far. That means all kinds of elements, but sort of a symmetric adjustment one can enter later into the debate. I think as far as the periphery is concerned, I think I may surprise many of you by saying this, but I think that they will need to evolve towards a more German model. And I was surprised, Peter, and I finish with this, that you did not get into the sort of these models of capitalism. I think the model of capitalism of some of the southern countries is just not feasible with being a member of a monetary union with Germany. This is not just any monetary union. This is a monetary union with Germany at the center. That's why it's not a monetary union as we read in the textbook. This is a monetary union with a particular macroeconomic policy, stability, and a particular way that we endowed the European Central Bank. So we have reproduced at the European level a sort of a German model of macroeconomy. That, as you, Peter, know, requires also certain wage settlement institutions. And the kind of wage settlement that we have and we had in the southern countries is just not compatible with that. It's just not compatible. So I think this is going to be a very, very hard. And what has not been done is that Greece, Portugal, Spain, a number of other countries, Italy, they were the most enthusiastic to enter into the euro area. They were the most enthusiastic, much more than Germany was, much more than the northern countries that were already in the demarc zone. But they forgot after entering into the euro area that linking themselves to this kind of monetary policy had all kinds of other implications. They forgot it, but everybody else forgot. The system is at fault. And that's why I don't want to say that Greece is at fault. I don't think that Spain is at fault. I don't think that Portugal is at fault. I think the system did not work. The system did not create the banking issues, the banking union, did not monitor. It monitored certain things that were the wrong things. And what was really necessary, which is linked to the competitiveness, to the wage kind of settlement, which is, I think, fundamental to the kind of new macroeconomic regime that they entered into. Nobody paid attention to that. Thank you.
Thank you, André. With that provocative note, Loukas Tsoukalis.
Thank you. I suppose one of the problems with this panel is perhaps that we do not disagree sufficiently. Let me start with the point made by our chairman, namely that this is the worst crisis that we have experienced in Europe since the Great Depression. And alas, the end is not yet in sight. So being asked to talk about the political ramifications of the crisis, I suppose it depends very much on how you see the crisis evolving in the next few months or years. And I'm not a prophet, I'm not sure how it's going to evolve. And therefore, political ramifications will largely depend on the evolution of the crisis in the months and years ahead. The first observation is rather commonplace to make is that I think Europe will emerge weaker out of the crisis, both economically and politically. Economically, it's obvious. Remember that at best, we expect to reach income levels of 2007 again in 2016. So it will have been a wasted decade. Europe, in the meantime, will have lost much of its credibility, the credibility it had before, vis-à-vis the rest of the world. And Europe will also have become more inward-looking. Perhaps even more important is that Europe will emerge more divided, both between countries and within countries. What I mean between countries, we have heard that from my fellow panelists. The crisis has been experienced in very different ways in individual countries. Economic divergence has grown remarkably. And economic divergence combined with rising populism and rising Euroscepticism and a rise of extremist parties in individual countries makes European solutions very difficult to reach. So on the one hand, we have a division between creditors and debtors, between North and South. And on the other hand, we have an internal division rising within countries, especially those countries that are more badly affected by the crisis. We have witnessed the rise of Euroscepticism. Support for European integration has reached levels it hadn't reached for decades, perhaps ever. Anti-systemic parties are rising, and so are extremist parties. And I expect that the elections to the European Parliament in 2014 are going to produce a rather unpleasant result. And the European Parliament may be more diverse as a result, but sometimes it will look like a zoo. So we have division between countries, we have division within countries. And division within countries is not only the result of economic recession and the rise of unemployment, but it is also the result of a widely spread perception that decisions are being imposed from outside. And that again leads people to more Euroscepticism. There's another important change, which is the result of the crisis, and this is that the balance of forces, the balance of power within Europe has changed. It is creditor countries that call the shots, and Germany in particular. And it is not only a shift in the balance of power between countries, but we have also witnessed the rise of intergovernmentalism, the weakening of common institutions, with the notable exception of the European Central Bank. So, perhaps another thing that I might add is that it's going to be a Europe that emerges with a more right-wing agenda. Not only with the emphasis on fiscal consolidation, but also with a growing emphasis on deregulation, especially of labor markets. Having said all that, so a weaker Europe, a more divided Europe, a Europe where the balance of power has shifted, a Europe with weaker institutions and more intergovernmental, you may be surprised to hear me saying that it is, however, possible that Europe may end up more integrated as a result of the crisis than it was before. And this may sound like a paradox, but probably it is not. Exiting the crisis requires more integration in terms of the banking union that Andrés has talked about, It requires much closer coordination of fiscal policies. It may actually require more radical steps towards some kind of a fiscal union. It will require the strengthening of European institutions to provide the political legitimacy for the kind of things that you need to support the euro and the monetary union. Yet the problem is, so economics and the crisis is pushing us in the direction of closer integration, at least for the Eurozone. And I would fully agree also with Peter Hall that not only are we seeing Europe being more divided, but Europe also being more multi-speed, because there's a division within the Eurozone, but there is also a growing gap between the Eurozone and the rest of the European Union. And I think this is something that's unlikely to change in the years to come, namely the euro will continue to determine membership of the core, and that will have implications for those who are left outside. But having said all that, so economics and the crisis seems to be pushing the Eurozone, at least not the EU, but the Eurozone towards more integration. The trouble is, there is no political appetite for it. And there's no political appetite for it for the reasons that I've already explained. That support for European integration has declined, anti-systemic parties are rising, Eurosceptic parties are rising, so how do you do it? And there I don't know. I'm not actually sure what is going to prevail. Is it economic logic or political reality that is going to prevail? Because economics is pushing us towards more integration, and politics is resisting that kind of integration. If you wish, I mean, Europe may find itself in some kind of an equilibrium of terror. We are unhappy with what we have. We are unwilling to do anything further to deal with the problem, and we are terrified of the consequences of the breakup. This is a very uncomfortable situation to be in a couple or a polygamous kind of relationship that we have in the European Union, and I'm not sure what is going to be the end result of it, and I'll stop.
Thank you, Loukas. Larry Summers.
Thank you, Jeff. When I was president of this university, I was asked to speak at many, many different events. And the only thing they had in common was that everyone in the room knew more about the subject at issue than I did. Now being asked to speak about European politics, I have a sense of deja vu. Not entirely sure what an American economist can contribute, but since I was invited, let me do what I can. I will make 6 observations. First, European Union, for all the problems, is one of the great projects of mankind. After a millennium of intermittent carnage, war is now inconceivable on much of the European continent. When the Berlin Wall fell, the success of the Union was a magnet for nations behind the Iron Curtain. The goal of nations that cooperate rather than compete to operate in a smaller world is instantiated nowhere more than it is in Europe, and therefore all people of goodwill should wish the European Union well and should applaud the nobility of the experiment, the vision of the founders, and the determination of those who carry on, even as they raise a variety of questions about both strategy and tactics. Second observation, the currency union was a triumph of hope over experience. It was a triumph of political will over economic rationality. It was a lesson of economic science that currency unions among disparately governed, substantially structurally different places was unlikely to succeed. It was perhaps the greatest regularity of monetary economics that one country, one money, And that was what the attempt was to overturn. It was the prediction of the vast majority of well-trained macroeconomists that, unconnected with the politics of this, that this enterprise would fail and come to grief. And the decision was made to go ahead anyway, in part because of a regrettable snobbishness towards economics that is seen again and again in politics. People who would never dream of saying that a nuclear reactor has to be built, even though nuclear engineers said that it was dangerous, feel entirely comfortable with an economic construction that economists deem to be unstable. I would note parenthetically that those in the software engineering field may feel this week in the United States that a certain snobbishness was displayed towards their discipline as well. But the surprise is that the first 10 years were smooth, not that substantial problems subsequently appeared. Third observation, the problems that emerged were substantially different than those that most economists predicted. Most economists focused on the issues pointed up by optimal currency area theory. In essence, that Texas works because when the Texas dollar area works because when bad things happen in Texas, taxes are paid much less to the center and people leave Texas. When bad things happen in Montreal, the Canadian dollar fails. Neither of those margins of adjustment are available in a common currency area. That's true and is a problem, but was not actually the essence of the problem here. The essence of the problem was actually much more a common pool problem suggested by a different metaphor. Imagine that a dining club was formed in which we would all go to dinner each week. And imagine two regimes. One, we each paid for our meal, and the other, because it made us all be in more solidarity, that somebody would pay for, that we would each pay 1/70th of the cost of the meal. And ask yourself what would happen as we went to dinner each week with 1/70th of the meal. The wine would get finer and finer. Fish would recede from the menu in favor of filet. Now imagine that we each had the privilege of inviting as many guests as we wish to join the meal, and we would still pay 1/70th of it. Before long, somebody would have the bright idea to sell seats at the meal for $10, and they would find that collecting $10 was much better than paying 1/70th of the meal. And if you think about the equilibrium of that system, the entire United States would be supping at our table, and the thing would prove unsustainable. In essence, the effort to draw on the common reservoir of European and German credit produced a situation of that kind that led to an enormously happy dining. That's what Greece's credit spread of nothing in 2008 was all about, followed by a radical wake-up call. That's what happened afterwards. The model proved fundamentally unsustainable in its early design. Fourth observation, growth is likely to come back glacially, if at all. Imagine that all of the problems associated with excessive deficits, associated with excessive interest rate spreads, associated with the repair of banking, imagine that all of it was fixed. It's still true that countries that are stagnating need an engine to get them going. Often, most of the time in financial crises, that engine is a sharp increase in competitiveness associated with a devaluation. Not possible when you're within a currency union. Sometimes that engine is a period of low real interest rates and significant inflation that lead to significant anticipatory spending. Not possible when you're in a currency union and don't set your monetary policy. Sometimes, as in the United States in 1940, that engine is a substantial fiscal impulse generated by some need or some Keynesian theory that leads to an increase in government demand. Not possible within the prevailing austere understandings within Europe. There is no viable theory in place at this moment for a substantial resumption of growth in large parts of Europe. Yes, there is the possibility of structural reform, but upon reflection, a significant number of structural reforms actually increase supply rather than demand, and in demand-constrained economies are likely to increase deflationary forces rather than to generate demand. It is true that if there are regulatory barriers and you can remove them and stimulate investment, that stimulates demand and is constructive. It is true that if there are substantial failures of property rights that are holding back investment, that there is scope to generate growth. Those are vitally important agendas to work on, but the specifics of Europe make the challenge of resuming growth immensely serious. And let's be clear, in the United States, which is largely free of the problems that I just described, or at least free by European standards of the problems I just described, we are now 4 years after the financial system had been effectively repaired. 4 years after credit spreads had been normalized, 4 years after the date of the recession trough had been announced, and there has been essentially no increase in the ratio of employment to population, and there has been essentially no growth outstripping the potential of the US economy. So the growth problem in Europe is, I think, more profound than is recognized by most observers. Fifth observation, German economic thought is, on these matters, is a classic exemplification of Keynes's fallacy of composition. Keynes's famous fallacy of composition was the observation that what's best for one person is not always, what's true for one is not always true for the collective. The classic example is that if everybody in this room, if one person in this room stood up, they would be able to see better. If everyone in this room stood up, no one would be able to see better, and everyone would be less comfortable, and so everyone would be behind. The classic example of Keynes was the recognition that if I save more, I will accumulate wealth, but my spending is your income, and so if everyone tries to save more, everyone spends less, and there is less wealth. The one thing, and there's only one actually, that all economists of every political stripe agree on is that since there is no trade with Mars, the sum of the world's trade deficits has to, maybe not as measured, but has to, in a logical sense, be zero. It follows that no one can have export-led growth without someone else having an import-led spending expansion. German success from being the poor man of Europe was achieved almost entirely through an increase in competitiveness, manifest by an increase in net exports, financed by the substantial provision of unwise vendor finance to the European periphery. To hold that out as a model for the European periphery, while at the same time maintaining commitment to being competitive, is an arithmetic nonsense. Yes, this is a complicated problem. Yes, you cannot borrow without limit. Yes, there are enormous amounts of public spending in the European periphery that need to be restructured. Yes, egregious errors in structural policies that have built up over periods of decades need to be corrected in the periphery. Do not hear me as advocating some kind of unreconstructed Keynesian solution. But the German vision that if everybody just did what we did, this could somehow be okay, is a denial of the laws of arithmetic, as surely as the statement that 3 + 2 = 6 is a denial of the laws of arithmetic. Sixth, and finally, and the subject of your panel, the politics of this in a global sense are tragic. A stagnating, demographically diminishing, increasingly present-oriented rather than future-oriented Europe, preoccupied with profound internal problems, will surely recede from the global stage. That Europe is, after all, in terms of numbers of people and weight of GDP, more than half of what has traditionally been called the West. The other half of the West, the United States, is not without its own serious problems. At a time of massive political change and upheaval in the Middle East, broadly understood, at a time of very rapid change in which economic progress has vastly outstripped political institution development in Asia, the West has to remain central to the operation of the global system if that global evolution is to be healthy in terms of our values, no matter how broadly defined. And a weakening Europe makes that a much less certain prospect. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, all four of you. I find it remarkable, although knowing all four, not that surprising, that these remarks in their combination could conceivably have been written by the same person. The amazing concordance of both analytical views and normative views. It's also remarkable, if somewhat disturbing, that that person would be very pessimistic, keeping in mind, of course, that a pessimist is just a well-informed optimist. Nonetheless, we have some very, very interesting issues on the table, and I'd like to invite now those in the audience to use the microphone here to intervene. And I will point, because I can't really see who is whom, since my vision is limited. So raise your hand and I'll point.
3 points. Karl Kaiser. Peter, your point about the multi-speed Europe strikes me as not being really new. We've always had a multi-speed Europe. We've always had enormous disagreements. Think back to the controversies between the Gaullists and the non-Gaullists, the British version, the German version, the French version. There were always enormous differences. There were always different groups, some that went ahead a little more than others. Think of the Schengen Europe, etc. So I don't think that, what you call the mishmash, I think the mishmash is the reality of European integration, has been and will continue to be. That in itself is not necessarily a problem. Now, I want to come secondly to a point that Larry Summers made. I think you are right when you point to the arithmetic fallacy that not all countries can conduct an export-led growth. But that is not the point about what has been called the German model. Not at all. We speak about the German model, and André mentioned that before you came. What we're really talking about is modernization. Talking about deregulation of labor market. Doing the kinds of things that happened under the Schröder government. Europe will not survive without a fundamental reform of their societies, their taxation systems, their pension systems, their labor markets, getting rid of the privileges of unions, etc., and all of these things. That is the part that we have in mind when we speak, or at least some people have in mind when they speak of the model. Finally, André made a very good point about the possibility of a grand bargain. And I think that grand bargain is not so impossible. As we speak, there are negotiations ongoing between Social Democrats and Christian Democrats in Berlin. And it seems to me that is the very essence of what they're discussing. Because it has been the Social Democratic demand that more help should be given, and it should have some conditionality in it. And the conditionality is exactly the reform of societies that in the long run will recreate the competitiveness which is missing in the South.
Comments? Anyone? Go ahead. Larry, go ahead.
Carl, I'm not sure I completely agree with you, though I see your point with regard to the second observation. Perhaps it goes to the perspective of a macroeconomist. You are certainly right that the substance of the German reforms was not a decision to adopt a mercantile export strategy. The substance was a set of labor market reforms, reductions in rigidities, change in pension rules, change in tax rules, change in social insurance arrangements. You are 100% right about that. If, however, you ask the question, when that was done, where did the prosperity come from? Where did the extra employment come from? Where did the improved fiscal position come from? I think you will find that you have to do a macroeconomic accounting, and I think you will find that it had very substantially to do with an increase in net exports. That without that increase in net exports, some of those measures by making workers poorer would have actually led to higher unemployment because they would have led to reduced domestic spending. And that therefore, the model in its play out is not a model that is available to all to pursue simultaneously. And so with great respect, I think your comment actually caught very well the spirit of German economic thought. And it's not that it's a completely irrational impulse, but I think it actually exemplified the fallacy of composition that I was speaking of, and that it's precisely the case that if everyone did that at once, there would not be. Germany is the one guy sitting in that second row who stood up and was therefore able to see better. And much of the advantage came from the fact that they were standing while others were sitting, and that if it was done universally, much of the benefits would be canceling out. And so I would actually insist very strongly that I actually have that right in terms of the right way to think about the German experiment.
Expanding the analogy, it may be that the Germans paid the people in front of them to stay seated.
Precisely.
Okay, André, then Loukas, then Peter.
Let me just add a comment to this. I just want to make sure that I was not misunderstood, and that when Larry made his point on the fallacy, he was not addressing my last point, which was that the southern countries needed to be more Germanic in structural terms. I think the essence of the grand bargain that I put forward, if you want, is this mix of the micro and the macro. Because I addressed, obviously, the macro issue, what I called before the balance of payment matter, and I fully recognize, I mean, I do agree, and I think this has been something that has been difficult to understand for many German economists, the role that indeed, in its recovery of being a sick man, there was not only the structural reform, there was indeed the space, the macroeconomic space that was created, financed a great deal by German banks, the expansion in the south. And I think that's why the solution has got to be both, in this grand bargain, both the macro element, what I call the symmetry, and that addresses your issue. Obviously, there's got to be a macro element. And I think one of the great discussions, and I think this will always remain a great discussion, that was true in the 30s, it's true today, one I think of the great discussions is how in Europe, I think, which is extremely hard, it's hard to do within a country. Now imagine to do this among 17 countries, or at least between two groups of countries, to do this grand bargain, where some have to do something on the macro side and some have to do something on the micro side. And there may be time inconsistency here, because you're dealing with governments. And I think this is why, although I like what you said, what's happening in Germany, I think it's going to be extremely hard, I think, politically, to carry out this grand bargain, because it involves many governments with different time horizons, and everyone is always worried, who is taking his part of the bargain first. In a sense, you can see the Germans saying, you first do your thing, and then I will deliver. And it's being done at a homeopathic dose, and this way, I think we may get caught in this terrible equilibrium. So I think it's very, very hard. Instead, you can say the central bank, the ECB, the one institution that I think has delivered, is the one that has tried to talk to the two sides. But I think we are lacking a political system to really deliver in an efficient manner this grand bargain.
At the risk of belaboring what might by now be obvious, let me just try a different analogy that may make the point. Frieden and I are both in graduate school. We're all in the graduate class. Frieden got an A. I got a B+. Most of the people got B pluses like me, but Frieden got an A. Somebody comes along and says, you jokers need to study harder. Look at Frieden. He got an A. He was the top student in the class. He got a really great job. He gets to teach at Harvard. Okay. Now, what's true? Two things are true. One is that we all would be better, and it would be better if we all studied harder like Frieden did. The other is, looking at Frieden's experience when he was the only one who studied hard, very substantially overstates the benefits to studying hard and what can be accomplished by studying hard. That's the way to understand the German example. It's not right to say that the other places don't need German-style reforms. It is right to say that they cannot reasonably expect to have anything like German level of rewards from German-like reforms, both because Germany was alone and because they're not going to be in any position to finance the other people to stand back.
Lucas.
Let me put it a bit differently. I mean, I would go perhaps as far as agreeing with Andrés that the periphery needs to become more Germanic. I would certainly not disagree with the view that the periphery needs fiscal consolidation, it needs modernization, it needs structural reform. All that is true. But the main problem with what has happened in the last 4 years is, first of all, that the pace of fiscal consolidation imposed on all the countries of the periphery risks killing the periphery. And number two is that there's been no symmetry of adjustment at all between surplus and deficit countries. The whole burden of adjustment of the crisis has been imposed on the deficit countries, and nothing has happened in the surplus countries. And that is the problem.
Peter.
I just want to speak to Carl's very good point about multi-speed Europe. I think I take the spirit of your point, which is that things have been messy before, and there have been ingenious routes found out of those dilemmas, and I think that's a very important point to remember in this context. The problem I have is that, and I think fears of multi-speed Europe, which some of us will remember, you know, the two-speed Europe, as it was called initially, and people said, well, this is impossible. You know, you can't have two-speed Europe. It has to be all for one and one for all, the Three Musketeers approach to European integration. And we quickly discovered that that wasn't the case. But it does seem to me that there has to be enough agreement among a set of member states about the level of integration they want to have in a particular area, and that we can't have a vast number of different kinds of agreements about that. And that's what I see lacking at the moment. I'm not sure that, I'm not saying there's no hope for the future. It's just that when I look at the Eurozone, I see no agreement really of any solidity on even the most important issue that Andrés pointed to, which is banking union. You know, I think there's hope there, so in that sense your point is well taken. But this glass is half empty as well as half full. We've got the first pillar, which is now underway with the stress test by the ECB, and then we're talking about the second pillar, but and maybe progress can be made on that very slow. So I think the spirit of your point is well taken, but when I look to see, okay, so which groups of countries are going to agree on a certain level of integration, I just don't see the political coalitions that make it possible.
Okay. I want to make sure we get some back and forth rather than having to go through everyone. So no more three-part questions and some quick responses. Go ahead. I think.
All right, so I have a question to Professor Summers. As you perfectly depicted, what cannot stand as an engine for South countries, growth, for the growth of South countries of European Union. And I'm interested, one can be an engine, but in the sense that if you were able to do whatever you like, so you didn't have the criteria at all, and you could change the situation which is now, and you couldn't change the conditions of currency union, what would it be? The engine that would bring the southern countries of European Union to catch up, and what then there will be an engine for European Union to make it growth more in the same speed to regain its position. Thank you.
So part of my answer was, part of my remarks were to the effect that I didn't have a great answer to that question. That the United States was largely free of almost all the issues one first discusses when one discusses Southern Europe, and U.S. per capita growth had been kind of negligible for the last years. And so if you sort of subtract 1.25 from the United States for demography, then it's not like we're doing so splendidly. So I think I don't want to minimize the difficulty of the problem, and those of you who are concerned with the political ramifications need to just recognize that even with great economic strategy, it may not be great. That said, European monetary policy remains significantly too tight, in my judgment. There needs to be significant relative price adjustment between the periphery and the Deutsche Mark bloc, and that is unlikely to obtain when inflation is very low in the north. There is a substantial underinvestment in cross-border financing of even high return infrastructure investments, investment projects in the periphery. There is, with all the reasons why austerity has been excessive, there is a sense in which significant parts of the periphery require their Thatcher and do not see their structural Thatcher and do not seem to have that in place, and its absence exerts an inhibition on a certain amount of entrepreneurial investment that could be taking place. And it seems to me that the posture of German economic policy, at one level, when you run as large a surplus, trade surplus, for as long as Germany in a demand-short world, it's natural that there's a tendency for people to call mercantilism on you, as the Treasury attempted to the other day. On the other hand, calling mercantilism on people who are one component of a monetary union is kind of a complicated thing. I mean, if somebody called mercantilism on Florida, what would Florida exactly be supposed to do? And so there is that problem. There are some answers. You can have less wage restraint at the center of policy rather than more wage restraint. You can have more expansionary fiscal policy rather than less expansionary fiscal policy. You can have more government credit in support of housing and less government credit in support of exports. So I think that a realignment of German economic policy in a less mercantile direction would be the fourth component of the program that I would move towards.
I have a question for the panel. Are you worried that you all agree? Because I think there's nothing more troubling than a consensus of the sort that we're hearing tonight. I was a great opponent of the creation of the euro. It was more fun to be an opponent of the creation of the euro in Europe than in American economics departments, where apparently everybody agreed that it was a bad idea. But when I hear discussions like this, I think, God, we're really underestimating the possibility that this works in a strange kind of way, and I think we need to give some thought to that, and I especially want you, Larry, to play devil's advocate against yourself and everybody else now, because that's what I hoped you'd do. I can remember eminent economists, one of whom has been already cited tonight, predicting that the Eurozone was going to break up last year within a matter of weeks. And there was consensus on that amongst many US economists. Guess what? Not only did it not break up, it has more members now than it did at the beginning of the crisis. If you'd had this panel on January the 1st, not many people in the room would have invested in peripheral Europe, bonds or equities, but that was exactly the right trade to put on at the beginning of this year. The peripheral equity markets have outperformed even Japan this year. So I think we need to be really wary of this negative consensus when the US economists have been wrong already in this crisis. Here's what I want to suggest. The German model may be suboptimal, but it may also work in the way that the reunification of West and East Germany worked. The periphery in that case got screwed and endured extremely high unemployment until those people with talent left and everybody else just subsisted on the pretty generous welfare that was available. I think that's happening to peripheral southern Europe now. It's on a much larger scale, but it is more sustainable than this panel is allowing. Germany's the dog. Greece is a part of a relatively small tail. Banking union is happening. I'm more optimistic about this than Peter. I think we're going to get there. Although it's not sufficient, it's necessary. And therefore, I think we need to consider the scenario in which this works. Last point, populism doesn't matter. It's going to get a huge amount of attention. They will get very good results in the European Parliament next year, and it won't matter. It never matters. Everybody always exaggerates European populists. So let's consider, play devil's advocate, Larry, the ghastly possibility that 3 + 2 might actually equal 6 in the strange world of European integration. It's not optimal, but it's not going to fall apart disastrously.
Neil, look.
You want to rise to the bait?
Yeah, sure. Look, I've got sympathy for a moderate part of what you said. That's why I began by talking about how all people of goodwill should wish the unification project well, and noted that the currency union was a natural continuation of that project. I am not among those who ever predicted confidently that the union would collapse, because it seemed to me there were enormous forces operating to prevent its collapse. And I do not lose sight of the fact that if you viewed Europe as a whole from the perspective surely of 1946, almost certainly from the perspective of 1955, and plausibly from the perspective of 1980, with all of its problems, it's okay. And so I hear that very much. I think you are, with respect, reaching too far when you draw the analogy between West Germany and East Germany and the center and the periphery of Europe. I may not have the numbers exactly right since I'm operating off the top of my head, but I think roughly West Germany was 3 times as populous as East Germany, and I think that roughly the periphery of Europe is, depending on how you define it and depending on how much of France you include within it, is 3 times as populous as West Germany. And I think the will for Germans to support other Germans is greater than the will for Germans to support Southern Europeans. So I think the vision that somehow this is all going to be like what took place in Germany, I make the prediction with very considerable confidence that the Chancellor of Germany will not be an Italian 20 years 20 years hence, though I note that you might respond that the fact that the head of the ECB is an Italian is a kind of indicator. So I think that is pretty pretty substantially overdrawn, and I don't think one would want to push that as an example. I think it is possible that if you asked me to kind of put a much more optimistic vision on it all, the more optimistic vision that I would put is that the whole thing will be enabled to stay together, that the major financial distress has been resolved, that yes, growth will be slow, very slow, but growth is very slow everywhere in the industrialized world, and that on a per capita basis, growth in the European world is not going to stand out for being weak, and that there are many aspects of the quality of life that are attractive in Europe. And so relative to what is attainable in the 21st century, Europe is not hugely underperforming, that the challenge of social solidarity amidst growth is actually larger than the challenge of growth, and that Europe will be managing it better than the United States will. And so when historians look back on this period, they won't remember it all as a failure. They'll remember it as a difficult management of challenges done in a different way in Europe than in the United States. That would not be my best guess. My best guess is, as I expressed, somewhat more pessimistic. But I don't find what I just said implausible. I do find the analogy between West Germany and East Germany and Germany and the European periphery implausible.
I do want to get to the audience, but I have to say I brought along my soccer cards as being a European meeting, but I hope not to use them. So André and Loukas, very quickly, please.
Yeah, let's just go back to the scenarios I think we just heard. I would also consider that the most likely scenario is one where we are going to get through this problem, but I think I would agree that slow growth is probably going to be there with us for a few years. Now, why I think we are going to get through is that in the end, I think that it's in nobody's interest. Again, if you go back to prosperity, I think it's certainly not in anybody's interest to go into really great difficulty. And there, I mean, I just want to address a point that Loukas made, where he spoke of contradiction between the economics and the politics. I think that contradiction, in a sense, is not there from the viewpoint of Germany. I think from the viewpoint of Germany, and that's why I think much of what will happen will depend, I think, in the way Germany will want to address this. From Germany's viewpoint, I think that both they have an economic and a political interest in solving this problem. And then the difficulty that I see, I think the last thing that Germany would want is to be held responsible for the demise of the euro. I think that's certainly not on the card. Historically, it would be unthinkable, I think, for Germany, and German politicians don't want that at all. And I don't think it's in their economic interest to go back to a pre-euro system, because as much as citizens may not have loved the euro, business was very much in favor of the euro. So there is no contradiction there between the economics and the politics. I think the real question to me is are there partners to Germany to be able to go one step further? And there I think my worry is a little bit on the French side, another country that has not been mentioned. Mm-hmm. Because if you look at the Eurobarometer today, and you see what German citizens are saying about the euro, they are less dissatisfied than the average. They are not thrilled, but they are less dissatisfied than the average of the euro area. And they are much less dissatisfied than the French. The French are the extreme. They're in a very, very difficult position. And I don't think that one can make huge progress without Germany and France.
Loukas, quickly, please.
I very much hope you're right, but I suspect you're not. First of all, the comparison between East Germany and Southern periphery doesn't hold, not only because of numbers, but for a very simple reason, that after German reunification, almost 50% of the GDP in East Germany was subsidies from the West. There is nothing of the sort as far as the European periphery is concerned. Number two, I mean, if you have countries like Spain or Greece with 27% rate of unemployment and 60% of youth unemployment, there's going to be a wasted generation, no matter what happens. And if there is slow growth and there's also very uneven growth, there is a problem. I mean, those economies will be languishing for many years with unpredictable political and social consequences, forget all the rest. And then finally, I mean, your analysis of the rise of populism in Europe risks being a bit complacent, because we've never seen such a phenomenon for many decades in Europe. I mean, if the Europe Parliament is going to be populated with large numbers of Le Pen supporters, UK Independence Party, Vlam's party, Golden Dawn in Greece, and so on and so forth, it will have some implications for European politics. But furthermore, assuming that the European Parliament doesn't matter, assuming that perhaps that was implicit in your argument, even if it doesn't matter, I mean, populists are rising in national elections all over the place. I mean, Beppe Grillo got 25% in Italy. The radical left wing and other populists in Greece came very close to power. They're rising even in Scandinavia. So this is not a phenomenon that can be dismissed, I think, so lightly. It is dangerous to dismiss it.
German Zettelmeier. So if you look at the arguments of the Alliance for Germany, the anti-Euro party in Germany, against the euro, they're fundamentally two. One is a very strong belief that the euro construct, together with institutions that have then been created, exposed to, if you like, stabilize the euro, which is the ESM and now the banking union, will jointly sum up to or create a gigantic common problem, a big source of moral hazard. And then the second argument is actually a political argument, which is the view that the euro has been incredibly divisive, and that it has in some sense undermined the sort of first pillar of the European project that Peter was describing at the beginning, that it's not only the case that it's not just not a necessary condition for peace, but it's actually bringing out these old divisions. And so we've heard both of these arguments on the panel tonight. I mean, with a little more sophistication than is put forward by the AfD. Larry has made the first argument, and both Peter and Loukas have made the second argument. So in light of that, why is the panel not enthusiastically arguing to get rid of the euro? Let's just call it off.
I'm going to take another question. Hold on. Over on that side. And people can perhaps comment on a couple together.
Thank you. My name is Emeritus from the Department of Sociology. Back in 2004 and 2005, I was a student doing fieldwork in Brussels. And lots of the observations made at that time very much echo some of the observations Professor Hall and Professor Tsoukalis were making today. And that is of more divisive Europe, more intergovernmentalist in the negotiations. At that time, the treaty negotiations and the multi-annual financial framework negotiations were just about to begin. There was a lot of talk about the faltering support for the European project, and there was discussions of multi-speed Europe. My question to you is, and all of that was described as an enlargement fatigue. My question to you is, to what extent this enlargement fatigue echoes in the political implications of the financial crisis that you're describing today, and more importantly, what do you believe are the political implications of the financial crisis for the future of the enlargement of the EU as one of the important aspects of the EU political picture?
So let's think of that as two interrelated questions. One is the euro worth sustaining? And the second is the euro and the EU worth expanding? Anyone want to tackle that?
Look, at one level, there has to be something in this. There are a number of families my family is friendly with. In the case of some of those families, if we all went and shared a vacation house for 3 weeks, the friendship would not survive. And so the friendship depends upon some constraints on intimacy. And the essence of the concern is something of that kind with respect to pushing the union project too fast, and I think that has a lot of, there's a lot in that. I think that it has to be circumscribed by two things. One, I think you can argue both sides of would it have been better if the euro had never been invented. But there's a lot of irreversibility in life. There are plenty of couples who, in the fullness of it all, it might have been better if they hadn't gotten married, but it's best not to get divorced given the investments and the results of the marriage. And it seems to me that it would be catastrophic on a number of levels to see the monetary union disintegrate, starting with the short-run mechanics of managing the disintegration, and followed quickly by what I think the critics are too facile about, which is what are the proposed monetary arrangements on the European continent in the absence of currency union? Is it that we're going to have easy commerce between France and Italy? It's just that there's an exchange rate that's going to bounce around by a few percent every month, but it'll all kind of work out and everybody will still just kind of be okay because everybody can hedge? Maybe. Seems kind of hard to believe. Is it that we're going to have intermittent pegs so that people are going to feel like it's stability, but once every 2 or 3 years, one of the pegs will bust up and some modern day version of George Soros, or even George Soros himself, will make a couple of billion and we'll get some realignment? And is that a long-term sustainable arrangement? I think it is, you get more enthusiastic about monetary union if you ask yourself two questions. One, what is the alternative monetary arrangement within the European continent? And the second question is, okay, deep down, if southern Italy had its own currency, managed by southern Italians, which it could devalue relative to northern Italy, do you really feel southern Italy would be profoundly better off? And most people, when they think hard about that question, think not.
Or Louisiana.
And or Louisiana, but I'm saying southern Italy to northern Italy's got some overlap with the periphery relative to the rest of the periphery. So I think you have to start where I started, which is that the European Union project is a profoundly positive thing, that what preceded it, really in a variety of ways, was not that great, and therefore, yes, there probably will be some excesses. Yes, there will be some things that are pushed too rapidly, but life is a matter of choices. You know, if you had it to do over again, should Greece have been included in the Union? I suspect the answer to that question is no. But if you ask yourself, what is the alternative monetary model for a Europe that was getting ever more closely connected, or what's the monetary model for life after the euro breaks up, I think those are very hard questions.
There are a lot of hands up, and I am in the position, I think, of Louis XIV, who said that when he made an appointment, he created 1,000 enemies and one ingrate. So I can only really point to a couple more people, and then I think I'm going to go back to the panel. So first here.
Thank you. I would like to go back to the structural reforms. And as you said, Professor Summers, you said that structural reforms are good but not enough if we want to go back to growth and stability in the periphery. And we all know that structural reforms have a huge social cost in Italy, Greece, Spain, and Portugal. I'm a Greek student, so I know that in Greece, from time to time, we have a huge debate about the mutualization of debt and the issuing of Eurobonds. And actually, the public opinion and the media, especially the media, they all think that that's the best solution, that's the optimal
To do
solution. The mutualization of debt and the issuing of Eurobonds. So I would like just to ask you what you think about that, because it's something very prevailing. It's something that
Okay.
exists in Europe.
And then, I think it's Charlie, I think, is that Charlie?
A couple of, one point and one question. Look, there's always the German problem. It was supposed to be solved by all this. Germany inside the tent is this problem is, the German problem is structural in many ways because of its industrial vitality, its size, etc. And the putting it inside a structure still leaves a problem. But Germany deferred. The European Union worked in part for 30, 40 years because of the fact Germany deferred to France politically in many ways. Many of the ideas came. And the problem is that France is not generating a political idea these days. And even if Germany wanted to be deferential, it's not clear what it would be deferential to. The question, one question, you know, I remember reading for years when devaluations took place. They don't solve any problems because they leave all the, they are an inducement not to tackle structural change. You get a quick fix with devaluation. So I am not sure that it seems to me the euro, I like Larry's, I agree with him, the euro's there, and I think it is in many ways a good experiment, and it will survive, and most people want it to survive. The question, though, I have is about growth rates. I mean, we're caught in paradoxes. We want people who retire early, like Frenchmen, to work longer, and at the same time, we can't always employ people who are young. So we have to expand employment. I think when the history is written 50 years from now or 100 years from now, we will see a period of difficulty for Europe, but will be part, I think, of, in fact, a real reproportioning of, you know, the world, of the economic world globe, in part of a transition in which, call it decline, call it shifting, whatever, in which the West is, you know, is put in a different place vis-a-vis other powers, and that's a painful process. That doesn't mean we should be complacent. We are not going to get growth rates, but it's not only for Europe, as you said. I think we've been in an S-shaped curve of growth rates where for 200 years we've enjoyed something totally extraordinary, and we may have to live with the stationary state in some way. So I'd like you to think about the long, you know, the really long term, which is comfortable for you.
So I'm going to now turn to the panel with two questions on the table and then an opportunity to say what they would like in the last few minutes. The two questions are at opposite ends of the temporal spectrum. One is specifically if you would like to comment on the question of Eurobonds or debt mutualization, and the second is where does this fit into the longue durée? I've learned to say, where does this fit into the long picture of the relationship between European growth, and the rest of the world? Or you could interpret that, if you like, in saying, when we look back on this 10 years from now, will this have been a fundamental change in the characteristics of the European...
30 years.
Or 30 years, okay, well, yeah. A fundamental change, or is it just a bump in the road? Okay, and I will invite, maybe in the order in which we started, we can go down the line, or Peter, then André, then Loukas, then Larry to sum up.
Interesting discussion. I look forward to tomorrow's discussion.
Yes, let me say that. I know a lot of people had their hands up. I couldn't call on anywhere near all of them. Almost all of us will be here tomorrow, and so we can continue this tomorrow in this room, starting 9:30 in the morning. There'll be lots of the topics, I know from my own panel, lots of the topics that were raised in this panel will be dealt with in great detail over the course of the day tomorrow. Peter.
I mean, I think behind these questions are really two questions. Will the euro survive? And I think the answer there, Larry Summers has given the answer that I would give, certainly probably better than I could give it, which is yes, because it's better than the alternatives. And that's important. And I think we're seeing the steps that are being taken to make it survive. There's a fiscal easing in Europe. I mean, there is this is not something that seemed to be on the cards a year ago. So there's a desire to make that conditional and structural reform, but the European Council and the European Commission are very good at fudging those kinds of issues, and that's the kind of politics that we probably need at the moment. So, will the euro survive with a kind of muddled politics? Well, yes, that would be my prediction. But the other question, which in some sense was the mandate given this panel, was, well, will European, and which you raised to some extent, is, well, can we expect political integration in Europe to move forward? And there seems to be some kind of urgent reason for that, which is to say the Eurozone would work better if it were more integrated politically. And then there are broader reasons too. And that's where I'm more pessimistic. I mean, I think Neil Ferguson is right that, yeah, there's far too much agreement on this panel. I didn't expect it, but I spoke first. If I spoke last, I would have what I had to say. And yes, I think you're right to remind us that Europe is very good at muddling through. But what are the prospects for political integration? I revert back to my initial non-negotiable statement. I think they look fairly bleak, because I think that, as Charlie said, the Franco-German motor is not really there, and the question is whether a German motor is there. I mean, I think the current German government is ambivalent about exactly what it wants the euro to survive, but exactly what does it want Europe to be and to do, and that is the other change. For a considerable period of time, Germany saw European integration as its own future. I don't know whether Carl agrees with that, but that's how I would see it. When I look in the mirror and I look for the future, I see European integration. It's not clear to me that that is the dominant view in Germany at the moment. Yes, the European Union should survive, but do we prosper only through the Union? I think that's an open question in Germany today, and I think that it's an open question in other countries as well, but I think that's why we have to wonder about the future of political integration.
André.
Yeah, I would agree that muddling through should be anyone's central scenario. I think usually that's the case in Europe. But to be blunt, I would say this is certainly not sufficient. And I think when we look back, and I often have the occasion to say that to politicians in Europe, I think when we will look back in 30 years from now, my guess is that we will regret very dearly what is happening at the moment. And the fact that European politicians for the last 5 years have been mirrored in the short term. The world is moving at this whole discussion of the West and the rest. I think the crisis, the financial crisis, in the US and in Europe, which is lingering in Europe and which has morphed into the euro area crisis, and which has concentrated politicians just to think of the very, very short term. They have forgotten about what is happening on the global scale. And therefore, they are not taking the right decisions about the longer term issues, the big challenges. So they're taking the right decisions, painfully, about the euro, about the survival of the euro, and about muddling through. But as I said, I think we will see in 30 years from now that we will have wasted 5, 10 years that were, I think, crucial years where there was this tectonic changes taking place, where the world was changing, and Europe was not there, was not at the helm where it should have been in taking the bold decisions in order to be able to be a more important player in this game, because it was focusing on its very, very short-term issues of the euro. And I think this is very, very regrettable, and but I think this is what will happen.
Loukas.
I certainly do not think we're near the end of the crisis. There's more to come. Yet I would endorse the view that the euro is likely to survive simply because there is a critical mass of people, especially people who count, who seem to be convinced, rightly or wrongly, that the alternative is much worse. And as long as this remains, the euro will be there. That's number one. Number two, you've asked us about Eurobonds and mutualization of risk. The Eurobonds are unlikely to come anytime soon because, apart from anything else, I mean, the German Grand Coalition, both partners, are not willing to discuss it. But I would perhaps put it in a provocative and very blunt way. Much of the debt that exists in Europe today, both private and public, is simply unsustainable in conditions of very low growth and almost zero inflation. You can't write off the debt through growth or through inflation. So the choice facing the European creditors to some extent is between mutualizing the debt and forgiving the debt, because there's no third alternative. And I would stop there.
Larry.
Two quick answers, one prediction and one request for indulgence for a story. My kids are wildly enthusiastic about the idea of mutualizing our family's debt. It's sort of logical for them to have that preference, and it's sort of logical for Greeks to have the preference in Europe, and it doesn't prove a huge amount. It doesn't prove a huge amount either way. Charlie, you overstate the case a bit. I kind of made your point with my line about southern Italy and northern Italy. On the other hand, Mr. Keynes was right and Mr. Churchill was wrong about Britain going off gold. There are a variety of examples of successful devaluations that have had substantial economic impacts, and so I think it's a non-economist's conceit to suppose that monetary arrangements aren't hugely important, including devaluations, so I wouldn't go there with you. The consensus in this room, which I think is right, is that the euro will survive. And certainly, if I had to bet, I would bet that way with quite strong odds. The argument that's being made in its favor is not completely airtight. The argument is basically, well, everybody wants it to, and everybody's got a huge stake in it, and everybody will desire it to. Well, that's true. Nobody really wanted World War I to happen in the form that it did, but they also wanted to be proud and to uphold their positions, and they thought they could have both, and they turned out to be wrong. And when people overplay their hands, then accidents sometimes happen, and you can't pull back. And it is, as one who's now lived through several financial crises, there is an important difference between financial crises in history and in memory. In history, in history and memory they're the same thing, but in actuality. In history and in memory, they're just like a horror of bad and crisis. In reality, they are crises with periods of months or years of lulls when things feel like they've gone back to normal, but they haven't. And then there's another crisis that is even worse. It was consensus view in June of 1988 that 2008 rather, that life had returned to normal with Bear Stearns repair and things were kind of back to normal. It wasn't so. And so I guess I would say I would bet very much on the maintenance of the euro, and yes, the European periphery bonds, Neil, have been terrific, and that would certainly be the way I would bet, but accidents still could happen. And if it fails, it's not going to fail because people decide that it should fail. It's going to fail because people think they can have Teutonic virtue and monetary union, and they overplay their hand. And that's still a risk in the situation. Last, on Charlie's question, if you'll permit me a brief personal digression. I was fond of saying at the beginning of 2009, when asked, what was my role, what was I attempting to do, how would I know if I had succeeded with President Obama, the answer I used to give was that my children had just completed their advanced placement course in U.S. history. And I had been struck that all kinds of events that seemed very important to me, like the 1982 recession and the 1987 stock market crash, had not been mentioned in their course, but that they had spent 5 weeks studying the 1930s. And that I would judge us to have been successful if high school history students in 2030 or 2040 did not study this financial crisis. And I had in mind, I had to say it in a slightly different way, that I also had in mind in terms of things that I had lived with. Korean students in 2030 will not be studying in their history classes the financial crisis of 1997 in Korea. Dramatic, existential, and profound as it felt at that time. But at least if their history books are halfway honest, which is a question, Japanese students in 2040 will in fact surely be studying the financial crisis that began in Japan in 1989. So I think it's a very important question. I would have said when I left government in 2010 that the odds were about 90% that I had succeeded by my criterion, in the sense that there had been substantial repair and that it would be a big cyclical fluctuation, not a profound historical event. Given that growth has been slower in the almost 3 years since, I'd take 90% down. I wouldn't take it down to 50%, but I would take it down from the 90% I felt when I left. I don't have that serenity with respect to Europe today. It's certainly possible that it will be a slow growth place in a slow growth era, and that these problems will not be profoundly important. I would certainly recognize that as a real possibility. But, you know, I do think that if you want to be optimistic about Europe, you do have to reckon with a kind of where is the energy coming from. Our high-skilled immigrants in substantial number moving to any place that has a currency within the Union? Who is producing children, which is a kind of expression of faith in the future, at above replacement levels? Where is there meaningful product innovation that is being disseminated around the world? And it's hard to find positive answers to any of those questions from within the Euro area. And I don't think that's unrelated to the cyclical malaise and slow growth that has plagued it. So I would agree completely with your attempt to move the perspective to the kind of long view, how will historians look back? But I'm less optimistic about what they'll say than I think you were.
And on that note, it's very appropriate to point out that the proceedings tomorrow are virtually in their entirety aimed at trying to understand the extent to which this may be a turning point in European economic and political affairs, and if so, turning in which direction. So I invite those of you stimulated by the questions raised here by Charlie, Larry, and all of our panelists to come back tomorrow and find out what the answer is.